Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's lovely, lovely, lovely to see all of you here today. Thank you for having the self-discipline to come in out of the sunshine and into this windowless room. You should all get special recognition for that. I'm Maria Wolf, President of the World Affairs Council, and I think we are going to have a remarkable presentation for you here today. Before we get to that, I'd like to tell you a little bit about some upcoming things at the World Affairs Council. This Friday at noon at Portland State, we are having a panel discussion with some of our international visitors. Many of you have been active in the International Visitor Program. You know that we get about 500 remarkably interesting emerging leaders from nearly 100 countries visiting Portland every year. This is a group of Serbians who are water resource management specialists. There are 6 of them, each one nicer than the last, and they're going to be doing a panel discussion at PSU at noon on Friday. I don't know the room, but call us up and eventually we will know. Thursday, September 20th, that's next week, we will have a presentation at noon. It's a brown bag sort of thing in our offices in the Oregon Historical Society building, 3rd floor, called The Next Wave, Oregon and Ocean Energy. You may have seen the article in the Oregonian just a few days ago about the really interesting, innovative work that's being done in Oregon on wave energy. So you can hear it directly from the source next Thursday at noon. Then, for your long-term planning, we have the World Quest Global Knowledge Competition for adults. So you can tell the people who have been to this because they're the ones that are snickering. This is more fun than you ever thought possible, certainly at a World Affairs Council event, which tend to be a little dignified, a little cerebral, not exactly stuffy, but not flamboyantly fun. This one is very different. It's at the Oaks Park Dance Pavilion, which should give you a clue. It's bad spaghetti and good wine, and tables of competitors vying for not much, except the chance to beat each other. And it's a fundraiser for our K-12 education program. For many years, we've had a World Quest competition for high school students, which is serious business. These kids prepare all year. They're wonderful, inspiring high school kids. We then send the winners to Washington, D.C. It's really a great thing. That and many other things of the K-12 education program need help, need sponsorship. So we thought we would, instead of just asking for your money, we would provide a very fun evening. Jefferson Smith has been the moderator for the 2 years, the MC for the 2 years that we've been doing it, and we think he's going to do it again, win, lose, or draw, but I will assure you that someone else will drive him to the event. One last thing, there you may see some brochures out on the table about a trip to Vietnam. This was one we told you about a couple months ago. It sold out practically instantly, but there have been a couple of cancellations in the last couple of weeks, so it's in our newsletter, and I hope you will join me and some other friends from the World Affairs Council in Vietnam, December 2nd through 17th, optional add-on to Angkor Wat. So hope to see you at some of these events, maybe even Hanoi, who knows. Today, we really are honored to have Trita Parsi join us. He is the founder and president of the National Iranian American Council, a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization promoting Iranian American participation in American civic life, and certainly one of our leading experts on U.S.-Iranian relations, also Iranian foreign policy and, in general, the geopolitics of the Middle East. Dr. Parsi was born in Iran, but moved with his family at the age of 4 to Sweden. He attended Johns Hopkins University, a School of Advanced International Studies, where he studied under the famous Professor Francis Fukuyama. In addition to his PhD, Dr. Parsi holds a master's degree in international relations from Uppsala University in Sweden, and also a master's in economics from the Stockholm School of Economics. He has served as adjunct professor of international relations at Johns Hopkins School for International Affairs, adjunct professor at the Middle East Institute, and is a policy fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center of Scholars in Washington, D.C. Dr. Parsi has worked for the Swedish Permanent Mission to the UN, where he served in the Security Council, handling the affairs of Afghanistan, Iraq, Tajikistan, and the Western Sahara, and in the General Assembly's Third Committee, addressing human rights in Iran, Afghanistan, Myanmar, and Iraq. He's regularly consulted by Western, Middle Eastern, and Asian governments on Middle East affairs and writes articles on Middle East affairs, which have been published in diverse publications, every one of them famous, ranging from the Financial Times to the Nation, Wall Street Journal, American Conservative, and the Jerusalem Post. Also a frequent commentator on BBC News, the PBS NewsHour, CNN, Al Jazeera, and NPR, to name a few. He's the author of the recently published A Single Roll of the Dice, Obama's Diplomacy with Iran, and Treacherous Alliances, The Secret Dealings of Iran, Israel, and the United States, both of them published by Yale University Press. We did have a few copies here. We sold them instantly, but I would commend you to Powell's. They are sold out, actually. We cleaned out their stock. But you know how to order online, and it's so much better if you order from Powell's than Amazon. It is our great pleasure to have Dr. Parsi with us today. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Maria, for that kind introduction, and to the Council for inviting me to come here to talk to you about this very important issue. We should, of course, not let this coincidence escape us that this is happening on the day that 19 terrorists viciously attacked the United States. And perhaps we can take that as an opportunity to look deeper and see what can be done to make sure that tragedies of this kind can be avoided in the future. Because we are here today, let me just give you a warning. That introduction is probably the most pleasant thing you're going to hear today. Everything else is going to be pretty depressing. So if you are already a bit depressed, I don't mind. I won't take offense if you leave, because I don't want to be responsible for pushing you over the edge. But I will try to find a silver lining in all of this, because I think there are still opportunities to be able to avoid some of the worst disasters. And right now, you cannot open a paper without hearing that there are either threats of an attack, or that the Iranians are saying something that is deeply offensive, or that there is pressure and conflict and tension between the Israeli Prime Minister and the President of the United States on how to handle these issues. And what I want to talk to you here today is to give an idea of how we ended up here, because I think a lot of people hope that with Obama coming into office, we would be in a very different place than we are here today. What I'm going to address here first is to see exactly how we ended up here. Why is it that earlier this year, Leon Panetta, Secretary of Defense, said that he put the risk of war between the United States and Iran at 50-50? And then later on in the Q&A, hopefully we can address some of the more recent developments that have taken place over the course of the last year, particularly when it comes to the new round of negotiations. But let me start off by giving you a quote from Obama himself. To the Muslim world, we seek a new way forward, based on mutual interest and mutual respect. To those who cling to power through corruption and deceit, and the silencing of dissent, know that you are on the wrong side of history, but that we will extend a hand if you are willing to unclench your fist. Only 12 and a half minutes into his presidency, Obama reaches out to the Muslim world at large, but specifically to the Iranians, offering a hand of friendship if Tehran in turn would unclench its fist. It was a very bold move, but not one necessarily born out of desire as much as it was born out of necessity. As far as we know, talking to the mullahs in Iran has never been a childhood dream of Obama. Rather, this was coming out of what essentially was that while many would argue that President Bush pursued wars of option, Obama had come to the conviction that peace with Iran had become some form of a necessity for the US's largest interest in the region. It's important to understand the background here. The Bush administration pursued an ideological foreign policy. One of its tenets read that you do not talk to your enemies, Because if you talk to your enemies and if you pursue diplomacy with them, not only do you risk strengthening them, you will also legitimize them. And as a result, diplomacy should be set aside for those states that deserved America's friendship. And you should only talk to those that more or less agreed with you. Now, whatever one's view is of this ideology or this tenet, I think the track record, specifically when it comes to Iran, is quite clear. During the 8 years in which the United States under Bush refused to engage in anything strategic when it came to diplomacy with Iran, there were some episodic episodes of diplomacy. Iran went from having just a few dozen centrifuges to having more than 8,000. Iran went from having been squeezed between two mortal enemies, the Taliban to its east, Saddam Hussein to its west, to becoming the kingmaker of the political order in those two states by the time Bush left office. Its influence was waning, but by the time Bush left office, Iran's stock in the Middle East, particularly on the Arab street, was extremely high because it was cleverly taking advantage of America's increased unpopularity in the region. And its influence, particularly in the Levant, was increasing significantly. That is the track record of that approach. And it's against that backdrop that candidate Obama decided to do something that no one else had dared to do before him. He made the idea of talking, the idea of diplomacy, he wanted to reinstate that as one of the tools of American statecraft. And talking to Iran, for whatever reason, became the poster child of that foreign policy platform. Now, what under normal circumstances would have been political suicide, in 2008 actually became a winning card precisely because of the American population's general rejection of the Bush foreign policy and its underlying philosophy. But Obama knew by the time he entered office that time was short. For several different reasons, the administration's own estimation was that if diplomacy is to work and yield some results, it has to be done within the first 12 months of the administration's period. And the reason for this was severalfold. On the one hand, Iran's nuclear program continued to progress. And Iran was building a stockpile of low-enriched uranium, LEU, and we'll get back to that as to why that's so important. And as Iran's program was increasing and advancing, the pressure for various types of actions, including military ones, would increase. Secondly, there was a lot of pressure, particularly from some US allies, such as Saudi Arabia and Israel, who were very fearful of what diplomacy with Iran would mean for them, fearing that it could be an abandonment and fearing that this would lead to a situation in which their strategic interest in the region would be compromised if the US and Iran found a way to resolve their problems. The EU, incidentally, was by and large quite optimistic in the beginning, but they too had several different qualms, and they were very fearful that Obama's eagerness for diplomacy, as they viewed it, would cause him to compromise the agreed upon red lines that the West believed needed to be implemented on the Iranians. And then, of course, there was this constant threat of a potential Israeli military strike, a military adventure that the US military, both under Bush as well as today, as well as when Obama came into office, believed would be a disaster and would be negative for America's interest in the region. In fact, of all of America's key allies, many wished Obama well, very few wished him success. That's how he started off his diplomacy with Iran. Now, after 30 years of enmity, one of the first things the administration realized it needed to do was to change the atmospherics between the two countries. 30 years of calling Iran either axis of the evil or rogue nation, the Iranians calling the United States the great Satan at every Friday prayer, had not created an atmosphere that was conducive to diplomatic success. And the administration realized that they needed to change the language, change it from a language of confrontation to one of reconciliation in order to create a context that could make diplomacy work. And to give you an example, candidate Obama had on several occasions said that he would negotiate with the Iranians using carrots and sticks. This is a common American expression. It doesn't have much of a negative connotation. But by the time he came into office, the State Department informed him, essentially saying that this specific term does not translate particularly well to Persian. Whether linguistically or culturally, essentially means Iran is a donkey, and you're going to either lure it or punish it into submission when you say carrots and sticks. Within 2 weeks, this terminology, at least when used vis-a-vis Iran, was eliminated from the vocabulary of the State Department. Until this day, I have not seen any US official use that language again. I think it's an indication of a genuine desire and effort on their side to try to change the language. But the biggest step, of course, was on March 21st, the Iranian New Year, in which President Obama did something quite unique and unparalleled. He did a 3.5-minute video message that was aired on the White House's website as well as on VOA, to addressing both the Iranian people as well as the Iranian government. In that message, he expressed deep admiration and respect for the Iranian civilization. He explained that there are obvious problems between the two states, but this can be resolved. And then he mentioned the many challenges that exist between Iran and the US cannot be resolved through threats alone. A great, significant, and clear departure from the approach of the previous administration. The hope was to signal to the Iranians that there was a genuine desire on the American side to see a strategic shift in the way that the two states interacted with each other. Now, the Iranian response, however, was very quick and not particularly uplifting. The day after, in the city of Mashhad, which is the hometown of Iran's Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, he gave a speech in which he spent about 40 minutes or so just going over every sin the United States has committed against Iran from the Iranian perspective, or at least from the perspective of this current regime in Iran. But towards the end, Khamenei said something that was quite interesting. He said, if you change, we change. And he expressed doubt about Obama's ability to deliver, saying that Iran does not know who makes the decisions and who writes the policy in the United States. Is it the president? Is it Congress? Or are there other forces in the shadows, he said. I live in DC, I ask myself the same question every day. So I'm not surprised that he wouldn't know. But the fact that he said, if you change, we change, was then elaborated on later on by the Iranians, essentially saying, changing the language and changing the tone is not sufficient. If there is a substantive shift in policy, then Iran will reciprocate that. That was nevertheless not particularly uplifting, but positive enough for the administration to continue on its effort to try to start negotiations. The problem was this, though. 4 months have passed since Obama came into office. It's very difficult because you have to put a bunch of people in the bureaucracy. That whole thing usually takes 3 or 4 months anyways. It was April, and now the next challenge the administration was faced with was, should they talk to the Iranians before or after the June Iranian elections? There was a fear on the American side that if they began negotiations before the elections, could that some way, somehow, inadvertently, help Ahmadinejad get reelected? They didn't know, but they didn't know if it could or if it couldn't. And since Obama obviously doesn't want to put Ahmadinejad's re-election on his resume, they decided to pull off and wait till after the Iranian elections, and at that point try to start the negotiations, even though 6 months would have passed of the very valuable 12 months that they had. The expectation was, though, that by June 13th, 2009, the day after the elections, it would be very clear someone would have won, a few people would have lost, and whoever won, the US administration essentially was ready to proceed with diplomacy with. This is, however, not what happened. Instead, you had massive fraud in the elections, followed by even more massive abuses of human rights and a very violent repression of the Iranian people, who took to the streets in unprecedented numbers, demanding that their votes be counted, and later on, in the face of such a brutal response from the Iranian regime, even increased their demands and at some points even called for the regime's entire downfall. What this also did then is that it created political chaos in Iran, and the political elite in Iran was essentially at war with itself, incapable of not only conducting foreign policy, but certainly incapable of conducting any negotiations with the United States. And this was a significant problem for the United States because it meant that even more time would be lost. But let me give you small parentheses here. I don't want to go into the debate as to whether there was fraud or not. In my own estimation, looking at the evidence, I think it's quite clear that there was. But just to add a couple of anecdotal things to give you a picture of what was happening that summer. Most of this book is based on interviews that I did with both officials from the US side, from the Israeli side, the Saudis, the Iranians, but also several people from the Iranian opposition, including people who were in the inner circle of the key opposition figure, Mousavi, Mir Hossein Mousavi. On the morning of election day, June 12th, one of Mousavi's headquarters in Tehran, he had two, is attacked by about a dozen security officers who get into the headquarters and say that they need to close down the headquarters because the Mousavi campaign is broadcasting a TV show without having a proper license. There was no such thing. All you had was a bunch of young people who were producing YouTube videos in a form of a get out the vote campaign that they were putting up on the internet. Now, what happened was that the volunteers at the Mousavi campaign actually wrestled down the security officers, tied them up, and locked them in the basement of the building. They called the head of the Iranian judiciary and asked, what are we supposed to do? He tells them this is a police affair, call the police, they'll take care of it. They call the police comes, they release them to the police releases them on the spot outside of the building, and they disappear into the crowds. 2 hours later, they're back with reinforcement, and this time they do sack the headquarters, and they begin the arrest of the first and the second circle of advisors around Mousavi and another candidate called Karoubi. It became a decisive blow to the opposition because with the inability of the leader to have this first and second circle of people around him, he essentially became more or less disconnected from his grassroots movement. And further down in the summer, that became a major problem because it was very difficult. People were talking about that this is a leaderless movement. It's because of an inability to communicate. Incidentally, the orders to arrest these individuals had been issued 4 days before the elections. That evening, I interviewed a person who was working at the Iranian TV who did receive the call before the polls had closed that they have to announce that Ahmadinejad has won the elections with 63.5%. Now, this, mind you, was before the polls had closed. Now, I'm not saying the Iranians are as incompetent as our friends in Florida. But to count 40 million votes in a matter of hours before they have been cast, because the polls had not closed yet, is a degree of efficiency that the Iranian government never has exhibited on any other issue that I've come across. Is this a smoking gun? Perhaps it's not, but it's sufficiently convincing to me there was something very fishy going on in those elections. Now, what does this then mean for the United States? It meant, first of all, that this was the first moral dilemma of the administration. It was one thing to argue in favor of diplomacy and realize that strategically it's a superior option. But it's a different thing to do so at a time when the very regime you're supposed to talk with is engaged in such brutal human rights abuses that is so visible for the entire American public to see. But more importantly, beyond the morality of it, because unfortunately morals is not necessarily guiding policy anywhere in this world, was the fact that more time was now being lost for the United States. Because 6 months had passed, there was only 6 months left, and now there was no clarity when there would be any clarity in Iran, when they would be ready to negotiate. But something had happened only 10 days before the elections that had convinced the administration that there was a promise in diplomacy and that they had to pursue it. On June 2nd, the Iranians sent a letter to the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, El-Baradei, telling him that Iran wants to buy fuel pads for their Tehran research reactor. It's a reactor that was given to the Iranians by the United States in 1967. It's used to produce medical isotopes for about 800 to 900,000 Iranian cancer patients. They were running out of fuel, and they wanted the IAEA to inform potential producers, sellers, of this request. El-Baradei immediately realized that this was a huge opportunity. And it goes back to what I said earlier in the talk. The Iranian LEU count, the low enriched uranium count, was increasing. LEU is what you can use to either build fuel pads for a reactor, or you can use it to build a nuclear weapon. You need approximately 1,000 to 1,200 kilos of LEU to be able to build one nuclear bomb if you do it perfectly right the first time, which obviously no one will do, but nevertheless. The Iranians were past that sometime early spring 2009. And as a result, they actually did have a material for one bomb. And the administration had been thinking very hard, what kind of solutions could they come up with that would convince the Iranians to give up their LEU? Now they had an opportunity, because now the Iranians themselves were coming with a proposal saying that they wanted to buy fuel pads. The idea emerged that instead of selling them fuel pads, the West would suggest to Iran, we'll take your LEU and we'll turn it into fuel pads. You get what you want, which is the fuel pads. We get what we want. We don't want you to have material for a bomb. And this El-Baradei realized as well, so he broke protocol. He was supposed to tell all potential suppliers. Instead, he only informed the United States and the Russians of this request by the Iranians. And immediately negotiations and talks began between the United States and Russia about coming together on a common proposal to put in front of the Iranians to say, let's negotiate about this. By August of 2009, it became clear. Time was running out, and the United States essentially made a calculation. Either it tries negotiations, even though it recognized that clarity did not exist inside of Iran. But the flip side was, if they didn't try it now, there may not be an opportunity to try it at all, because a 12-month period would run out. They informed the Iranians of a desire to negotiate. The Iranians respond positively in September. And on October 1st, 2009, for the first time, the United States, Iran, and the rest of the P5+1 states, the permanent members of the Security Council in Germany, meet in Geneva to negotiate a proposal on how to resolve or to do a confidence-building measure on the nuclear issue. To many people's surprise, Iran accepted in Geneva the principal idea of doing a fuel swap. Details of the proposal per se was not discussed at that meeting. Instead, it was agreed upon that Iran would open up one of its facilities for inspections, that it would meet with the United States and the P5 at the technical level within a few weeks and hash out the details of this proposal. That happened on October 19th in Vienna, and it's at that moment that all of the different problems emerge. At this moment, the United States presents the idea to the Iranians in detail. And the idea is that Iran at the time had about 1,500 kilos of LEU. They need 1,200 for a bomb. The United States wanted Iran to give up 1,200 kilos of that LEU, send it to Russia. Russia would enrich it to a higher level. Then they would send it to France. France would turn it into fuel pads. And about a year later, the Iranians would get their fuel pads from the West. The Iranians had several objections. The first objection was, who invited the French to the party? The Iranians did not want to see the French be involved in this because they had several past dealings with the French in which they were not very pleased, and there was an ongoing dispute over actually a nuclear issue. Their second objection was a little bit more tricky and a little bit more substantive. They said that the West doesn't trust Iran, but Iran doesn't trust the West either. The structure of this deal is such that the majority of the risk is put on Iranian shoulders, they said, because they're giving up a strategic asset, 1,200 kilos of LEU, but they're not getting anything back until 12 months later. A lot can happen in 12 months. What are the guarantees that the West will actually honor the deal and not renege on it? And they gave counter proposals, saying that instead of giving up all of the 1,200 kilos in one go, they would divide it up into 3 400 kilo shipments. Every time they gave a shipment, they would get fuel pads back. This was not acceptable to the United States for two reasons. One, you can't order these fuel pads online. This is a unique reactor. No one else has it. No one is producing fuel pads for it. So it would actually take a minimum of 6 months just to produce the fuel pads. But more importantly, for political reasons, the entire purpose of this deal was to make sure that 1,200 kilos of LEU quickly left Iran so that more time would be added to the nuclear clock, so that more time could be used for diplomacy. If you take it out piecemeal, that type of a political space that the administration was looking for would not be produced, and it wouldn't meet the United States' bottom line. By the third day of the negotiations, it was clear the talks were collapsing. Neither side was really budging. Neither side really made any changes to their opening position, only marginal changes. This was not so much a negotiation as it was an exchange of ultimatums. And then El-Baradei decides that we can either go out and say that we failed, or we can say that we're going to take it back to our capitals, think about it for 3 days, and come back with a final response in writing. They all agreed to do that. They spoke highly of the negotiations, and they said it would come back within 3 days with a response as to whether they accept this deal or not. The US, Russia, and France immediately accepts the deal, which wasn't too difficult. They accepted their own deal. The Iranians do not come back with a response. It's not a yes, it's not a no, it's nothing in writing, it's we like to have another meeting, we want to see. They wanted to see more meetings to be able to discuss and hash out mechanisms that would ensure, guarantee that the deal would be fulfilled. By early November, it was clear diplomacy, at least in this round, at least in this approach, had not produced anything that Obama could brag about at home. A year had been gone, much time for it was not left, and now the administration decided to do what was called activate the pressure track, meaning we would now go to the Security Council and we would push for a very strong sanctions resolution against the Iranians in order to punish them for having not accepted the fuel swap, while at the same time being able to tell the domestic audience in the United States that even though Obama tried diplomacy, and even though the critics of that were not just Republicans, but it was also his own Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, who at least during the campaign when they were both trying to get the presidency, disagreed on this. But to show that in spite of that, they did manage to get very strong sanctions and stronger international unity against Iran. The hope was that by February of 2010, diplomacy at the UN, meaning sanctions diplomacy, would succeed, and new sanctions would be imposed on the Iranians. That did not happen, though. The Russians, the Chinese are not happy. They believe that diplomacy was given up too quickly, that there were still opportunities to pursue things. They're not bound by the American political clock. So for them, that 1 year calculation was not necessarily fully valid. And very intense negotiations take place. And the United States, the White House is under tremendous pressure from Congress, who wants to pass sanctions as quickly as possible. February passes, March passes, April passes, nothing is happening, and a sense of desperation starts to emerge. But at that moment, something else happens that the administration did not expect. Two countries in the Security Council, Turkey and Brazil, who had no prior significant involvement in this issue, step up and say they themselves are going to negotiate and try to get the Iranians to agree to the fuel swap and save the day and make sure that diplomacy works. This was not necessarily greeted with tremendous joy. The US was very much focused on sanctions at the moment, but nevertheless, Lula of Brazil and Erdogan of Turkey go to Iran on May 16th, 2010. And they begin what ended up being 18-hour marathon negotiations, very tough negotiations. I sat down and interviewed the negotiators from all sides in this. But lo and behold, at the end of these 18 hours, they managed to get the Iranians to put their signature on the agreement and agree to a fuel swap deal built on the benchmarks that the United States had put forward back in October 2009. The second person, Celso Amorim, the Brazilian foreign minister, calls after he leaves Tehran is Secretary Clinton. Excited, beyond excited, I would say, because Brazil and Turkey had shown that not only are they rising economic powers, but they had also now proved their ability to resolve very complex international disputes that the Europeans for years had failed to resolve. But to his surprise, Secretary Clinton makes it very clear to him, the deal is absolutely unacceptable. The details of the deal was such. Iran would ship out 1,200 kilos of LEU, but instead of sending it to Russia, would send it to Turkey. Turkey would then keep it in an escrow. Russia would use its own LEU to produce fuel pads, send it to France, France would send it to Iran. The only difference was, if the West reneged on the deal, the Iranians would be able to get their LEU back from the Turks. And that way there would be a guarantee that would ensure that neither side would have any incentives to undermine the deal. But things have changed, Clinton said. In fact, she said that facts on the ground had changed. Iran had 1,500 kilos of LEU in 2009. Now they had 2,400. You take out 1,200, they still have 1,200. Moreover, the Iranians had increased enrichment at the 20% level, which they had not earlier on, and this was viewed as a provocation by the Iranians. So instead, 2 days later, Secretary Clinton goes to the Senate and announces proudly that they have now agreed on sanctions draft at the Security Council, and this was the clearest answer to the negotiations of the past week, she said, in the Senate. What the Turks and the Brazilians did not know was that the Friday before they arrived in Tehran, Russia and China had finally agreed on a sanctions resolution. And the United States essentially had to choose between a nuclear breakthrough or a sanctions resolution. And by arguing that facts on the ground had changed, they justified that they would now disagree with the mediation of the Turks and the Brazilians. And then there was also a lot of very negative press against Lula and Erdogan in the American media. And it got so uncivil that at some point, only a couple of days later, someone in Lula's bureaucracy released a letter signed by the President of the United States, dated April 20th of that year, only 3 weeks before Lula went to Tehran, addressing Lula, asking Lula, go to Tehran, negotiate with the Iranians, get them to agree to get out 1,200 kilos of LEU, not more. Put it in Turkey in an escrow, and get the Iranians to agree that they won't get back their fuel pads until a year later. Exactly what the Turks and the Brazilians did. They followed that letter as the roadmap for the negotiations. In fact, at one point, the Turks showed the Iranians the letter, saying, if you agree to this, we have already gotten America's agreement. This then created that significant tension between Turkey, Brazil, and the United States, because the Turks and the Brazilians felt that they had really done what had been asked of them, and not only did they not get a thank you, they kind of got some sort of a punishment for it. So why then did the Obama administration reject this? There was really nothing of what they said that is not necessarily true. Facts on the ground had changed. It is true. But it was not the reason why there was a rejection of the deal. What had happened was that the Obama administration had made a promise to Congress. Please wait with your sanctions. Let us get our sanctions in the Security Council first, then you can go ahead with your sanctions in Congress. If you put your congressional sanctions first, then we will not be able to get any UN sanctions, because the rest of the world will be upset about Congress passing laws for the rest of the world. And then they also had made a promise to the Turks and the Brazilians. So one promise had to be broken. 6 months before midterm elections, the President of the United States was not going to break his promise to Congress. And instead rejected the deal, went for the sanctions, and made sure then, of course, that in July of that year, Congress passed their sanctions and he signed it into law. There was also a realization in the White House that if they did break the promise to Congress, Congress would go forward with their sanctions anyways. And those sanctions would have targeted Russia and China. And that would have created a major conflict within the Security Council, and it would have broken the unity that Obama had managed to create against Iran. Instead, would have created a situation in which the Iranians would be able to play the various big powers against each other. This, of course, is based on the assumption that Obama at the time, as a result of having spent so much of his political capital on healthcare reform, felt that he could simply not have just gone to Congress and told them, we got this. We got a solution. It's a very good thing. It's based on what we actually asked him to do, and as a result, hold off on your sanctions. But the calculation in the White House at the time was essentially that that would not have been successful anyways. And as a result, it didn't happen, and as a result, we are where we are today. There is a perception out there that diplomacy failed. I think that is an unfair perception. What you had both in 2009 in Iran and in 2010 in the US was not a failure of diplomacy. It was a failure because the domestic political audiences in both countries prevented an acceptance. The Iranian objections in 2009 were not illegitimate, but they were not the real reason why the Iranians said no. The real reason why the Iranians said no was because their political elite was still at war with each other, and no one in the Iranian political elite wanted to see an agreement that Ahmadinejad would be able to take credit for, because tensions were so high. Similarly, the objections of the United States to the Turkish-Brazilian deal are not inaccurate, but they're just not that relevant, because it's not, again, the real reason why there was a no. These domestic failures have haunted this relationship and rendered it so difficult to be able to come to a solution. The title of my book is called A Single Roll of the Dice. It's actually a quote from one of Obama's own senior officials who told me that by the time the US managed to get to the table and get everyone else to the table in October 2009, the policy had become nothing more than a gamble on a single roll of the dice. Diplomacy had to work right away or not at all. And diplomacy almost never works that way. In fact, the US has a lot of experience with successful diplomacy. It took exactly 7 years for the US to get the Libyans to capitulate their nuclear program. Several periods during that 7 years, there were no talks at all. Talks broke down, but then they were started again. There's a wonderful quote from Senator Mitchell, who mediated the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland. He said that for 700 days, both sides told him that they would never agree to anything the other side would agree to. But on the 701st day, they both changed their minds. And as a result, managed to get a deal. Fortunately for us, and of course for the people of Northern Ireland, Senator Mitchell did not give up during those first 700 days. He kept at it. He had the political backbone and the political capital to invest, because war is not going to be easier than diplomacy. If we commit to war, we also have to commit to peacemaking. And the fear is now that if the political landscapes on both sides are such that it is politically less costly, less risky for a decision maker to decide to send off thousands of service men and women off to a war, even an unnecessary war, than it is for that same decision maker to send off a couple of dozens of diplomats off to negotiate the deal, then unfortunately there will be far more clenched fists than open hands between the United States and Iran going forward. Thank you so much.
I'm sure you all are as impressed as I am with Dr. Parsi's extraordinary presentation, and now he will indeed take questions.
Very informative topic. I enjoyed it, so I'm sure others did as well. Just kind of updating your presentation, Syria. I mean, this really potentially changes the calculation about regional hegemony. You get Russia and China both concerned about possible collapse of the regime, and therefore a U.S., Saudi, Israeli domination of the region. Just your take on it, which I'm sure is much more informed than mine and others.
I would actually agree with what you said, by and large, because you implicitly stated something that I think needs to be explicitly stated. In my estimation, the Syrian uprising was no different from what you saw in Tunisia, what you saw in Egypt, what we're seeing in Yemen, which essentially is a population tired of living under this dictatorship, and they rose up because they wanted to see a different political future for themselves and their children. The difference is, it didn't succeed in the short run, and as a result, by design of the Assad regime, he deliberately militarized the conflict, and now it's been hijacked by geopolitical contests and rivalries, both a regional one between Iran, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia, and to a certain extent Qatar, and by a global one between the United States, Russia, and China. And this global rivalry is now taking place inside of Syria, is being on the backs of the Syrian people, and is being paid for through Syrian blood. I find it somewhat extraordinary and counterproductive for the Turks, for instance, who on the one hand understandably are very, very concerned about what Assad is doing and the way he's butchering his own people. But also this alliance with Saudi Arabia in helping Saudi money reach the rebel fighters. Again, understandable at a certain level, but also if you just know a little bit of recent history, you know that wherever Saudi money has gone, it's not democracy that's tended to follow. It's usually radicalism, Salafists, and Al-Qaeda. And I don't see any reason why Syria would be any different. In fact, when you talk to a lot of journalists who come back, there's clear evidence that there is a very strong presence of that as well, which is very problematic for the rebels, of course. But it's about the fact that when the central apparatus in a state declines or collapses, you will have this vacuum created, and it's going to suck in all different kinds of elements into it. The Iranians, I think, are playing a very negative role as well in all of this. They are, on the one hand, stuck with Assad, and they can't help him or they can't get rid of him. They really don't know what to do. One Arab journalist, analyst, I should say, who follows this very closely, he said something very scary. He said the only ones that actually right now seem to have a plan in Syria are the Salafists. Everyone else is working on some sort of a mediocre plan B and reacting tactically. It's a very horrible situation for the Syrian people.
Have Israel and Netanyahu or AIPAC or whoever in that grouping played an influential role in the narrative you just gave to us?
Yes, absolutely. From the Israeli side, as I mentioned earlier on, there was significant concerns about diplomacy from the outset. And this is not a new thing. It's been going on for quite some time. But it's much more open. It's much more explicit now. Tzipli Livni, who was the then foreign minister of Israel when Obama won, was interviewed a day after on Israeli radio. And she was asked about Obama's Iran policy. And she answered by saying, well, in this region, things are such that if you're willing to talk to your enemy, that's a sign of weakness. And then she was asked by a follow-up question, does that mean that you oppose Obama's idea of diplomacy with Iran? And then she said categorically, yes. And that has been the position of the Netanyahu government. When Netanyahu when he got elected and he made his first visit to the United States in May 2009, the Israeli strategy was to essentially complicate this diplomacy. And the reason for that is there's a fear on the Israeli side that Obama, through diplomacy, would not succeed in getting a deal unless he's willing to accept that there's going to be some level of enrichment on Iranian soil at the end of the negotiations. And that's widely recognized, that the balance of power is simply such that getting the Iranians to capitulate is impossible. The best we can get is to limit their enrichment activities and make sure that it is under the strictest possible inspection forms. And many experts actually say it's not a bad deal at all. We shouldn't treat it as it's the second best. It's actually even better than what was the plan A during the Bush years. But from the Israeli perspective, this presents two very critical problems. On the one hand, it means that by having enrichment on their soil, Iran would then become a virtual nuclear power. It would be a threshold state, which then in turn would shift the balance of power in the region to Israel's detriment and reduce Israel's maneuverability. But perhaps more importantly, if there is a deal between the United States and Iran on this issue, it would obviously not lead to a love fest between the United States and Iran, but it would significantly reduce the tensions between the US and the Iranians. And then the Israelis asked themselves a very critical question. If there is that reduction in US-Iran tensions as a result of the deal, will it be followed by a proportionate reduction in Iranian-Israeli tensions? And the answer to them is no. And as a result, they fear that the United States will get some sort of agreement with the Iranians, reach some sort of a reduction of tensions, and then move on, while Israel would be left in the region facing an equally hostile Iran. And as a result, that kicks in the Israeli fear of abandonment. And as a result, their calculation that it's actually better not to have a deal at all than to go for something that could actually be detrimental to Israeli security interests based on how they have defined it. When Obama came into power, the Israelis were primarily doing 3 to 4 things to try to render this more difficult for Obama. One, they pushed very hard early 2009 to impose new sanctions. And the Obama administration resisted that, saying that if they come in and they impose new sanctions, they've already destroyed the atmosphere, so to say. If they want to really genuinely pursue diplomacy, they should not escalate with new sanctions. Secondly, the Israelis were pushing to have deadlines, 12-week deadline for diplomacy. Talks should not be given more than 12 weeks to succeed. Sanctions had been imposed on Iran for 25 years, but diplomacy should not be given more than 12 weeks. And this was something that the administration also rejected. They knew that there were some natural deadlines anyways, but they were not going to agree to any artificial deadlines for the negotiations. The third thing was that as the administration was trying to improve the atmosphere, not talk about threats, obviously not take away the military option from the table. It's always on the table. But there wasn't a need to make a reference to the military option every 5 seconds. So they were trying to recreate a better atmosphere. The Israelis did exactly the opposite. Increased the militaristic language, increased the talk of threats, etc., which then countered what the Obama administration was trying to do. And this was very visible during the May 2009 press conference. Because during that press conference, Obama starts off defending why he thinks diplomacy is right, and he thanks the Israeli prime minister and makes positive comments about the solid relationship they have, but makes absolutely no mention whatsoever about the military option being on the table. His answer is focused on, we're going to try diplomacy. Netanyahu gets the microphone and he starts off by thanking the president, and then he also thanks him, and thank you for guaranteeing that the military option is still on the table. Something that Obama had told Netanyahu in private in the meeting before the press conference, but deliberately chosen not to talk about publicly because it countered the strategy that he was pursuing. Instead, Netanyahu very quickly goes and thanks him for ensuring that the military option is on the table.
I recently read an article in Foreign Affairs magazine, a cover story, proposing the argument that it would be better to have Iran have the nuclear weapon because of mutual assured destruction, and that it worked with the USSR and the US, and even though the Iranian government uses hateful rhetoric, that they do not want to be destroyed, and so they don't feel that they would be a loose cannon. What are your thoughts?
Thank you. The author of that piece is Kenneth Walt, who is one of the biggest thinkers in IR theory, the father of the neo-realist school. I'm personally a big fan of his writings. I am not convinced about that article. I think I have several different problems with it. One is, I don't believe we're at a stage in which we have to talk about or to think that we actually cannot prevent a nuclear weapon in Iran using just peaceful means and diplomacy. I don't think the diplomacy has been exhausted. It's not anywhere close to being exhausted. I don't think we've given that a fair chance. And I personally don't think it would be better to have any more nuclear weapons in the world, period. There is some validity in his argument about the balancing, however. But there's several differences, of course, when it comes to what happened between the Soviet Union and the USSR. Precisely because of the tremendous danger of both sides having nuclear weapons. The Soviets and the United States opened hot channels, and there were red lines and all different kind of things, and they maximized communication. There was ongoing diplomacy all the time in order to make sure that neither side started a war, at least by mistake. Communication between the Iranians and the Israelis is extremely limited, let me put it that way. There's some arguments, there's some in Israel who said, well, if both have it, then both sides will be forced to establish more robust channels. But again, I think it's an argument that is valid in the sense of saying a nuclear Iran can be deterred. It's not an Armageddon, it's not a good thing, but it can be deterred, and we don't have to talk about it with this level of hysteria that we're talking about. But I think it's premature in the sense that we still have plenty of options and opportunities to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons, and that's the best option.
Two questions. The one that I was originally going to ask, it goes to the relationship between American people and the Iranians, separating them from their government, and to an extent perhaps us from our government. But in follow-up to that question there, some of the hype surrounding Tehran becoming nuclear capable goes to the allegations or assertions that it's radicals or 12ers that are running that dynamic in the Supreme Council between them and Ahmadinejad. So I just wanted that as part of the question to follow up to hers, and then the other goes to, again, our relationship with the Iranian people that I understand deteriorated after 1979 and our lack of follow-through or support of the Shah, and then subsequently the 2009 revolution, and whether or not we should have played that differently in showing more support for the people in their revolt against the fraud of the election.
Let me take that last part of your question first, because that's going to actually become a pretty hot issue in the elections, I suspect. By the time you have the first foreign policy debate between Obama and Romney, rest assured Romney's going to go at Obama very hard, saying that he's abandoned the Iranian people. I asked a lot of the folks in Iran who were in the Mousavi camp, including some of the folks that were more in the grassroots, if they felt, you know, what should have Obama done? Did he do too little? Did he too much? The first conclusion I drew from all of those conversations was, A, people actually didn't care that much about what the U.S. was or wasn't doing. This was not about the U.S. Many of them told me, look, this was not our key concern. We were so focused on what the regime was doing and how we were handling that. What Obama did or didn't do was not a top priority in any way, shape, or form. Amongst the leadership in the Mousavi camp, it was quite clear. They were very afraid that Obama would say things that were too supportive and would create problems for them. And they preferred him to stay silent than to say something or put on a green wristband or anything like that. That was not what they were looking for. I mean, keep in mind, if Obama today were to be endorsed by an Iranian politician, I'm sure people here realize that would not really play that well for Obama here. Similarly over there, getting Obama's endorsement was not necessarily what they were looking for. As time went by, however, there was a lot of frustrations because there were a lot of people, and particularly on the streets, who felt that Obama was saying far too little about the human rights abuses. It's one thing to take sides on a political dispute inside the country, saying who won the elections or not. It's a different thing not to speak out when there's such blatant human rights violations taking place. It took Obama about 10 days before he actually used the word condemn. And that was after the video of Neda started to be shown on TV. And the reformists in Iran, around Mousavi, were actually very cynical and thinking that the only reason Obama wasn't saying this is because he didn't want to undermine his chances of negotiating down the road. And they were very, very suspicious of him. On the streets, there was a divergence. The leadership around Mousavi tended to remain a bit more moderate, but the streets, because of the brutality of the Iranian regime in clamping down on them, became much more frustrated. And there you could hear people say that they wanted the outside world to do something or not. So there's a question of should he or shouldn't he? Is it the right thing or is it the wrong thing? I mean, McCain went out very early on and said that we have to go out and we have to endorse the Green Movement. To the best of my knowledge, he knows no one in the Green Movement. So for him to make that conclusion without having talked to them, I think it's not necessarily fair. But at the same time, we also do have to ask ourselves a very different question. Would it have been relevant? What can the U.S. do or not do? We know that in the case of Egypt, the U.S. did not play the most important role at the end of the day. When that revolution happened, the U.S. was not the main actor. But it did have some influence still, because of a relationship that existed, because of trade, because of support for the Egyptian military and money and aid that was going there. There was something. In the case of Iran, there's nothing. There's no trade. There's no exchanges. There's nothing. So what type of impact could it have done? I think we have to be very humble and realize that we don't live in that world any longer in which the U.S. makes a statement and that in and of itself makes things move in the rest of the world. It's not the case. And I think even worse, going back to your question about the Iranian people, I'm very concerned about the ability of the United States to retain the degree of support and sophistication and soft power that he has enjoyed in Iran for so long, in an odd way, in the sense that the regime is so venomous in its rhetoric against the United States, but the Iranian people tend to have very positive views about the United States, about the American people and American values. Things have happened, two things have happened in the last 3 or 4 or 5, 6 months now that I think are creating a very, let me put it this way, the balance of anger, I think, amongst the population is starting to shift towards the United States, against the United States, than in the past. They're suffering under tremendous economic hardships. And a lot of these hardships in the past, it's been difficult to know, is it because of the regime's corruption? Is it because of the regime's incompetence and mafia style running of the country? Or is it because of sanctions? And usually it's always been all of the above, but most of the anger was directed at the regime itself. In the last couple of months, two things have happened that I fear can shift this balance. One is, as a result of the financial sanctions that the Obama administration has imposed, in spite of exemptions for medicine and food are not reaching Iran. And you're starting to have severe shortages at Iranian hospitals right now. There's been articles in the Washington Post about it just last week. The first people who suffer are cancer patients and other patients that need more sophisticated medicine. But even ordinary medicine is now becoming next to impossible for the Iranians to buy because the bank system, the international bank system, won't handle the transactions. That is a direct result of the sanctions. That's not a direct result of the incompetence of the regime. Secondly, in the negotiation, and to add that, for instance, the financial sanctions against the Iranian central bank also caused the Iranian rial to now lose about 50 to 60% of its value. So everyone became half as rich as they were before, or twice as poor as they were before. The second thing is that in the negotiations that took place earlier this summer and spring, the US made it very clear, sanctions relief is not on the table. The US was not made some significant demands of the Iranians, but in this specific phase of the negotiations at least, the US was not going to lift any sanctions. And that was not a secret. The US, really spoke out very openly and said sanctions relief is not on the table. Well, if sanctions relief isn't on the table and sanctions are causing the medicine shortage, then I think it would be a miracle if the balance of anger still remained in America's favor. I think it's shifting. And I think it's a very detrimental thing, both strategically for the United States in the long run. There's not a lot of countries in the Middle East in which the streets tend to have a positive view of the US. Where we have it, we should retain it and nurture it. And secondly, for this entire pressure tactic to work, the theory behind it is that you want to create problems within the society, within the economy, that will then get people to pressure their government to change their policies in order to make sure that those pains are lifted. But if the blame for the hardship is not on the regime's policy, but on the US instead, then I don't think that pressure will come about. And then all of the pressure that we're putting on the Iranian economy right now will be nothing more than naked escalation.
I just wanted to ask, do you think the administration has given enough serious thought to the consequences of either Israel or the United States bombing the underground nuclear facilities in Iran against the peace-loving Iranians who are sympathetic to the United States and Israel to a degree?
Sorry, can you repeat the last part of this?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm just wondering about the amount of sympathy that the peace-loving Iranian people who are sympathetic to the United States to a degree, what their reaction might be if their underground nuclear facilities were bombed by Israel or the United States in the coming months.
I think on the US side, first of all, I think we should be very clear. The US military is pretty dead set against a military confrontation. And I think they made that quite clear. Some of the statements of both Panetta and Dempsey have shown from the US side, particularly the military, this is not something that they're itching for. And they also recognize that the regime could take advantage of a strike by being able to rally people around its side. So there is an awareness of that, without a doubt. Is it a decisive factor in their decision-making? I wouldn't be able to make an assessment of that, but there certainly is an awareness of that. There is a clear awareness that the Israeli military cannot do the type of damage on the Iranian nuclear program that would be in any way, shape, or form helpful. But there would be a lot of consequences that the US side believes actually would end up being beneficial for the Iranians potentially, such as being able to rally the people around its side, such as being able to threaten to walk out of the non-proliferation treaty because they've been attacked, and by that kick out the inspectors. So there's a lot of negatives that would come about, and the US estimation is that the Israeli military doesn't have the capability anyways to be able to make the type of damage to the program that would make the equation worthwhile.
Question? Perhaps one more brief question. We can go on all day, I know, but...
I just have one question, and it's about the Iranian street. Does the Iranian street, the majority of it, support the policy of becoming a nuclear power?
When you say nuclear power, do you mean having a nuclear program or building a nuclear bomb?
A nuclear bomb.
In my own conversations and looking at all of the different polls that have been made, and polling in Iran is very difficult, I can't recall a single poll that showed that there was support for actually building a bomb. However, in most, if not all, there was support for having a civilian nuclear program. This is a nuclear program that was started during the time of the Shah. It was started and boosted incidentally with the encouragement, direct encouragement of the US government. There were two gentlemen back in the 1970s that played a very important role in convincing the Shah to adopt a nuclear program. One of them was called Donald Rumsfeld, the other one was Dick Cheney, who was pushing the Shah to go for a nuclear program, hoping that he would buy American technology for that. So the idea of having a nuclear program in and of itself seems to have support. Now, is it worth the price? Are they willing to endure the hardships that they're now enduring as a result of this, mindful of the sanctions, etc.? I've not seen any recent polls that would show that, that would be able to make a determination of that. But as I said earlier on, I doubt that you're going to see a significant shift in that calculation as to whether it's worth it or not if sanctions relief is not on the table anyways. If they're going to give it up but they're still going to be under sanctions, then why would they give it up? That's part of the problem of the approach of negotiations that have been taken. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Parsi, for an extraordinary presentation, and thanks very much to all of you. Lovely to see you today, and hope to see you at another event very soon.